to our basic course on the practice of mindfulness. I'm Dr. Mark Musey, philosopher and professor of religious studies. In future presentations, Dr. Jane and I will set forth the basic elements of the theory and practice of mindfulness. But before we begin our conversation about mindfulness, we need to know a little bit more about what we mean by the term mindfulness. But before we can talk about mindfulness, it might be helpful to talk about its opposite, what we might call mindlessness. But we prefer the more precise terms of distractedness and restlessness. So for the next few minutes, I want to spend time telling you about distractedness and restlessness. And what I tell you ought to sound very familiar. The first thing I want to say is that distractedness and restlessness is our default state. This is probably where most of us live most of our lives. By distractedness and restlessness, I mean that mental state where our minds lack focus, attention, awareness, where we seem confused and restless. Part of the reason for this, we discover when we began to observe the mind, is that our minds are constantly churning out thoughts. Take a moment and just observe your mind. It's difficult to turn the thinking off. Our thoughts go from one to another, to another, to another, and oftentimes the train of thought seems to be rather random. When we begin to observe these thoughts, we can notice how strange they are. One moment we might have a very sublime thought, a very profound thought, such as, well, I could die at any moment. And then the next moment, the thought can be one that we'd characterize as rather ridiculous. I wonder what's on TV tonight. We go from one thought to the other, and oftentimes it just seems random and without cause. When we begin to observe our minds, we notice that much of what our minds produce could be characterized as sheer rubbish. By this, I mean simply that so much of our thinking is irrelevant and insignificant to the way we live our lives. We're constantly observing things and making evaluations about the things that we observe. If you're like me, you spend a great deal of time assessing every experience, every situation, every person that you're encountering. You're constantly observing and deciding, do I like this? Do I not like this? Is this a pleasant experience or is it an unpleasant experience? And those thoughts tend to focus on things that are not always in the present moment. For instance, we like to dwell somewhere else. We tend to spend a great deal of time thinking about the past. We spend a great deal of time thinking about the future. Now, there's nothing wrong with thinking about the past, thinking about the future, but the problem is when we begin to dwell there, when we spend most of our lives in the past or in the future. Consider for a moment how much time you spend thinking about the past, rehearsing a conversation you might have had with a friend or a spouse. And oftentimes, these conversations that you rehearse involve a great deal of regret. Oh, I wish I had said something differently, or I wish I hadn't behaved that way. When we're living in the future, we're often anticipating things that are to come. We like to make lists. We like to decide what it is we need to do next. Oftentimes, living in the future leads to a great deal of fear because we're anticipating things that might happen that actually never come to pass. Most of us like to believe that we're in control of our minds. In Western culture, in fact, we often identify with our minds. We think that the mind is the seat of the I, the self, that this is who I truly am. If most of us were to name the place where we reside as individual persons, we're likely to say it's in our minds. So we like to think that we control our minds. But on observation, we begin to realize that oftentimes our minds control us. I sometimes think of these hapless cowboys strapped to bucking bulls in a rodeo and how they're hanging on for dear life. In a lot of ways, our minds are like these strong animals that are bucking and pulling us in this direction and that, and we, like the cowboy, are hanging on for dear lives. The problem with restlessness, distractedness, and confusion is that it leads to stress and happiness. And so often the stress and unhappiness that we experience is so unnecessary. When we return in our next talk, we'll be talking about the antidote to this form of mindlessness, this restlessness, and this distraction. So to summarize what we've been saying, the distracted mind, the confused mind, the restless mind is our default state. That's where we live most of the time. The distracted mind is characterized by this restlessness and oftentimes confusion, a lack of focus and awareness. And the distracted mind leads to stress and unhappiness. When we return in a moment, we'll talk about mindfulness and how mindfulness can provide the antidote to this state.